I just recorded another review and I feel in a very rambly mood. And I wanted to talk about a film that's one of my all-time favorites, Fight Club from 1999, directed by David Fincher. And this is a film that essentially for me sparked my love for cinema. I always find it a little funny because of the line in the film, "I met you at a very strange time in my life," and I always feel like that's the way that I came to know of this movie was also in a very strange time in my life, and I very much so attached myself to that film, and it's a film that I've watched many, many times over the years, and to this day I still, every time watching it, I have a complete memory of how the movie goes. And yet, I rewatched it recently and had some takeaways and was actually surprised by how many things I feel like I haven't either noticed before or aspects that kind of added to my already existing understanding. And on top of that, I have a very big frustration with a lot of the fandom, so to say, of the film, and a very, very common misunderstanding, in my opinion. Obviously, art is, well, not obviously, but in my opinion, art is subjective, death of the author and all that. The film is what you take away from it. But I think that there's a very toxic interpretation of this film that to me misses a thing that I think is way more the actual point of the film. And obviously, author meaning doesn't necessarily need to mean anything to you, but just to slightly add to my idea, I've also heard the author of the book that Fight Club is based on discuss the way that he went about writing the story, and it kind of added to my already existing perception of it. So it's not new to interpret this film as being about toxic masculinity, where also, before I get into it, I guess, if you haven't seen the movie, you're probably going to be incredibly confused, so go watch it first. And yeah, so it's not new to interpret this film as being around toxic masculinity, and I think that while I completely agree with that, and I don't disregard that whatsoever, I think that there's a little bit of more of a universal aspect to the film when it comes to just finding balance in your life. That can manifest through toxic masculinity, but that's not the only aspect, and I think that while toxic masculinity is a really, really huge issue, and one that we should be very aware of, and to define it slightly for anyone who doesn't know the term and is thinking, oh, you're just saying masculinity is toxic. What I'm talking about is a feminist perspective of toxic masculinity, which is basically, toxic masculinity is the notion that basically to be masculine is to not emote, to not talk about your problems, not show emotions. And for me, as someone who's a very intersectional feminist, I think there's a huge importance to recognizing that while we have a society that's very sexist towards women, patriarchy affects everyone. Men are hurt by it in many different ways as well. I don't know if who's hurt more or if that even matters, really, because I'm just like, if there's issues, we should probably target those issues instead of trying to compare who has it worse. And so, basically, I think that there is a more universal aspect that while it is manifesting through masculinity, a lot of these aspects are more widely applicable. So the interpretation that I often find incredibly frustrating is that a lot of people look at this film and say, I want to be like Tyler Durden, like Brad Pitt's character. And I understand where it's coming from, I assume, I guess, right? I guess that the point is that I'm always kind of baffled by is, did you not watch the last part of the film? Because the last part of the film very clearly shows the narrator killing the Tyler within him, right? Getting rid of that aspect of himself. And realizing basically the toxicity and the bad sides of Tyler as a character. And obviously given that Tyler is him, that aspect of himself. And I am always kind of baffled, I guess, I don't know, if anyone happens to watch this review and did have this takeaway, I'm very, very curious how you interpret the last part of the film, because I really don't know how, though, through that interpretation, unless you're just thinking the narrator is self-destructing in a negative way and getting rid of a good aspect of himself, then I don't know how you'd interpret that part. But I think the very interesting aspect is that while, again, a lot of it is definitely about toxic masculinity, it is the need for generally not even moderating, but the power struggle between two sides of people, right? There's the idea of let's tear it all down, the Tyler narrative, right? And then there's the narrator, Edward Norton's character, which is just like become a complete consumer, buy things even if you don't really want them, spend money in a job that you don't like, the whole speech of like we work jobs we don't really like to buy things because the TV told us we need to. All these aspects, right? Those two forces are very existent, and I think that the end of the film goes to show that both those things, those extremes, are that extremes, and the character at the end of it, the narrator at the end of it with Marla, is a character that finds the middle. To use somewhat of a term from psychology, I guess there's like the id, the ego, and the superego, right? And the whole idea is to find the middle, right? There's the id, your drives, all these things. If I'm remembering correctly, superego is the whole aspect of basically trying to be extremely altruistic. And then there's just the middle of it, right? There's the trying to find what is actually good for you, what is actually the healthy middle ground, which doesn't necessarily need to be in the middle. It can be more to one side or the other, but finding the area where you take the good aspects from both sides and also combat the negatives in both sides. So I think that, again, while this is completely applicable to toxic masculinity and it is a problem where it's very useful to view it like this, I think that this is more widely applicable to people. And I think that while the film basically shows this kind of like lashing out, this thing of breaking out of the norm and tearing down systems and all these things, it's showing it through the aspect of fighting, something that gets people kind of like going and gets their adrenaline going and all these things, and demonstrates masculinity, to tie back to the aspect of toxic masculinity, because like, look, this guy's beating him up so good and stuff like that, and like adds to the way that he's perceived in terms of his masculinity. While there is all that, you could interpret that as being a way it manifests, but many people kind of, have these kind of these lashing outs in different forms. And I guess to tie back to the toxic masculinity aspect and the way that the film does talk about masculinity, because I agree, this is a story very much so about that. I just think that it could be more widely applicable when we take it as a kind of, like a tale. Like we look at like something from the Bible and we're not just saying, okay, this story, I'm not religious, by the way, just to emphasize, I know I'm wearing a cross shirt, I'm not religious whatsoever. I just think there's some stories that we can take, like, you can understand there's a message within them, right? We're not going one-to-one. We're not just saying, oh, this is saying that, like, if we're talking about the killing of Isaac by Abraham, right? To sacrifice him to God, to show him, like, hey, look, I'm very dedicated to you. We're not just talking about the idea of, like, showing, like, I guess religious people, for example, are not just talking about if God tells you to kill your son, kill your son. There's a grander point that we can take away from it, and we can understand this is about sacrifice for show of dedication to God, which again, I don't subscribe to, but I'm just saying that as an example of we can look at these things, and while it's told in a story, we try to look at the overall message of it. And the overall message could be on the level of this is a way that this affects men generally, not just the men in the story, but it could also be even more general and to say this is a way this can manifest, but the point of it is finding the kind of balance between both of these forces within each person. Because my takeaway from the film essentially is that you don't want to be the narrator in the beginning, and you don't want to be Tyler. And I guess I'll go more so into why you don't want to be Tyler. I'll touch on the narrator a little bit. I just feel like Tyler is a character that tends to be super idolized in a way that I really don't appreciate. And the reason you don't want to be him, besides the fact that he's obviously destructive, putting himself at risk, putting other people at risk, he doesn't have attachments. He doesn't get to be close to people. Like, he might be like a, like a cool character to look at. He should never be a role model, because this is, again, not someone who has someone he's close to. He doesn't care for people around him. He just has his own ideology that motivates him, but he doesn't really care about anyone. Nobody cares about him as a person, really, besides the fact of idolizing him, but not even viewing him as a person, right? Like, when we see, like, for example, the narrator, once he starts realizing what's happening, and he's trying to kind of rebel against the system that the Tyler within him built up, people are not even listening to him, right? Because all they wanted is that ideal. It's that Tyler within him. That's all they really wanted, all they followed. And he as an actual person is not actually respected. Nobody feels close to him. If something bad happens to him, they're not actually caring for him that much. And the whole breaking away from Tyler is the recognition of care for Marla. And I think Marla is an incredibly important character in this story, because while herself being very flawed, and we can understand why both of them like each other, because both of them are struggling to kind of find how to lead their lives in a way that's fulfilling to them. And I think there's something kind of interesting with the whole aspect where Tyler tells the narrator that Marla is closer to hitting rock bottom than he is, or living in rock bottom, sorry. And there's an aspect to that where Marla is a non-romanticized version of Tyler. I don't think I've ever thought of it in these terms, actually, until just now talking about it, but I think she's actually a really nice demonstration of that, where she is what happens when you just are a Tyler. A little bit, but obviously in a woman's character. But she's not happy about it, because she's alone. She doesn't have people that care about her. She doesn't have closeness or attachment. She compromises for people like Tyler that treat her horribly, because she longs for that attachment. She's the realer version of what happens to a person in this situation, and a person who doesn't choose to do that, because most people don't choose their coping mechanisms, right? Like, no less than the fact that the narrator, he didn't, like, consciously choose to invent Tyler. It's a coping mechanism he did, in a sense, because he wanted to be someone else. Marla also wants to be someone else. She wants to be that healthier ground, right? I'm not saying she doesn't want to be any aspect of herself, but she's kind of she's showing you all the downsides of what actually being Tyler is. And honestly, I've never really thought about it until sitting down to make this. But it's also nice because I think that kind of the inclusion of Marla, outside of just being a useful character to reflect on the narrator and his needs for attachment, she kind of shows what that actually looks like, the non-romanticized version of it. The kind of look at what a badass he is whenever he's, like, getting beat up and continuing to get beat up to, like, show a message or something. And I guess going back to, though, the aspect that is relating to masculinity, I guess a thing that I noticed this time that I don't think I quite picked up on in other viewings of this, is the factor where basically, I don't know how to say it in a way that doesn't sound kind of silly whenever I describe it, but there's a lot of talk of cutting people's balls off in this film, or balls being cut off generally, I guess, in this film, be it in the support group that the narrator initially goes to, where these are men that had their testicles removed because of testicular cancer, or later on, whenever they talk about castrating the deputy, I believe, who's investigating them, or even further later on, whenever the investigators tell the narrator when he tries to come forth about all the stuff that Tyler did and come clean to the police, they tell him that he said to, like, cut someone's balls off if they ever, like, temper with the operations. And there's, like, a very kind of, honestly so clear that I'm always almost baffled that I didn't pick up on it before, clear aspect of the tie of that to masculinity. You know, we have the whole saying of, like, that takes some balls to do or something like that, right? And the whole thing of, like, this group of men that are kind of viewed as pathetic, for example, in the beginning, because they're crying, they're, like, sobbing, all these things, but I think there's something kind of nice where the film, while being kind of, like, a little cynical, it's mostly from the perspective of the narrator, and we also do see some actual side stories. Like, the first story we hear the guy there telling is about how he always wanted, he basically talks about his ex-wife, and, like, they always argued about how many kids they want or what gender kids they want, and then he said, and last week she had a beautiful baby girl with her new husband, And there is a genuinely sad aspect. There's a little bit of a comedy where the way it's portrayed, the way he's crying, is a little mocking of him. But the story he's telling is genuinely sad, and you can feel for him and can feel like empathy and be touched by it and all these things. And there's also the aspect where essentially the narrator, who beforehand could not sleep, had insomnia, now has this ability to sleep. And I think the idea of it, which is kind of clearly portrayed even by the sense that he has a conversation with Marla where they talk about how when people think that you're going to die, they actually listen to you instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. And it's a very clear demonstration of the idea that both of them represent a very strong need for attachment, for people that care. And while they are deceitful, the whole idea of why they're even there is because they finally have a space where they're allowed to emote. They're allowed to... It doesn't even need to be verbal. They don't need to say what bothers them, and they don't, because they're in support groups for things they don't actually have. But people are actually validating the feeling that they have. They feel sadness and hurt about things that are going on outside that in their life, and the people around them are understanding. And these are like these spaces that are very uniquely accepting of people crying. There's like a montage of him going to all the different support groups, and you see him like hugging people hugging each other, people crying in each other's arms. That's a kind of validation that most people don't typically have, especially from strangers. But if you don't have close attachment figures in your life, you might not have that at all. And basically, like, the whole idea with him finally being able to sleep, to me, represents the idea that what he needed was that validation, was those people that get attached to him. And I guess the worry when it comes to Marla was the idea of, like, I don't know why she's here. I don't know if she's validating, right? She doesn't actually have these diseases, so I don't know if she's genuinely feeling for me. Which obviously is a little hypocritical because he's also there under false pretense. But it's this idea of once a person enters that's not clearly validating, you don't have that security there, you don't know what to do. And again, he can't sleep. And with that, he starts developing this character in his mind of Tyler. I wanted to take more note on, there's like flashes of Tyler in the beginning before he properly appears as a character. I tried to take note of a few of those to see how much that ties into the story, or rather the meaning of when exactly he appears. And I'm not entirely certain about all the points, but I do remember very clearly there's one aspect where the doctor that the narrator goes to talk about his insomnia and find a solution, that the doctor there tells him, you know, like, he's like, whenever the narrator says, I'm in real pain here, he says, real pain, swing by First Methodist Church. I remember this too well. I've watched this movie too many times. To the group of men with testicular cancer, that's real pain. Which also ties a little bit to me to another review that I did while it was written on Letterboxd about the film called The Real Pain. But basically, the idea is like he's kind of invalidating of his actual hurt, his actual issue in that moment. And in the face of that, Tyler appears, right? He doesn't have this attachment. He doesn't have the validation. What do? Do I just lash out? Do I just go the Tyler route? And outside of that, there's also this kind of thing of, like, going to a support group, an area where people emote, is scary. Being vulnerable, showing your emotions, trying to confide in another person is scary for people. And it's way easier to kind of just lash out in a way. It's way easier to be angry, to be violent, than to sit down and expose yourself and be vulnerable in front of another person at risk of being invalidated or being rejected. And yeah, I guess that the thing is that basically the Fight Club itself is basically the way for a lot of these men to, rather than sit down and kind of deal with their issues, or not even deal with their issues, but just express them, find people that they can attach to, they find that attachment within a space that kind of lets them have an outlet which I wouldn't even necessarily say is bad in the beginning of it, right? Like, listen, I'm a very, when it comes to anything social or whatever, I'm a very libertarian person. As long as you're keeping safe enough, you know, if you and a bunch of other people want to meet up to have a fight club, go forth, you know? I feel bad for your medical bills if you're American, but, you know, if that's what you want to do, go for it. My only problem is that I worry that people there are basically using that as means to not really face to themselves even what actually bothers them in their life. And whereas a nice aspect that could have been there is to take that fight club and from there have closer connections. It doesn't happen because those are all people going there to lash out and they don't see each other. Like the whole, his name was Robert Paulson, or in Project Mayhem, we have no names. The whole idea of that is you don't have a personality, you don't have vulnerabilities, you're not even a person, you're just someone I interact with to gain this thing, right? And through that, nobody gets to really show their vulnerability. And I think, like, I guess even outside of the fact that, like, Bob, as a character, again, similar to Marla, very much so obviously serves the narrator's kind of development as a character, in the sense where once he died, because he was shot by the cops doing something for Project Mayhem, this is obviously a thing that's supposed to be kind of a wake-up call for the narrator of, shit, bad shit is happening because of me to people that I realize I do care about, right? I don't think anywhere before that point we ever heard him say that Bob is his friend. And at that point, once Bob is already dead, he says it. And that's sad. He gets to emote the most how much he values this person when that person is no longer there. And again, I think there's a reason that that's a wake-up call for him. Because, again, both for him, but also for the audience, the idea is this is a person we know, right? This is a character we have more attachment to than anyone else in Fight Club, besides Tyler and the narrator. So, the idea is kind of that. But also, on top of that, there is a little bit of an aspect where Bob is the only one in Fight Club, again, besides the narrator, that we actually see ever express any vulnerability beforehand in the film, right? We see him talk about the whole aspect of the fact that he took steroids and his kids won't talk to him, his wife divorced him. Even whenever they try to set up Project Mayhem and they do the whole test where you need to stand on the doorstep for 3 days without food or encouragement, and only if you manage to withstand that, you get to go inside. Bob, like, unlike the other guy that was before him, and any other person, honestly, that we see there for Project Mayhem, that we see short snippets of them kind of being put to that test, he's the only one that we see as soon as he's told no, takes his bags and starts walking away, and then the narrator invites him back in, right? And I don't think it's coincidental that, like, obviously there's the food aspect, and the whole idea is basically just how capable of withstanding difficulty are you, or adversity are you, but the encouragement aspect of it is also really big, because the whole idea is that the Tyler aspect completely invalidates this. The Tyler aspect looks at vulnerability and closeness as being weak, and that's the biggest flaw within that character. And that character is preventing the narrator from reaching attachments that he needs. We all do. And it makes him not able to actually connect with people in his life and puts them at risk in a sense of also being hurt. Obviously here it's like they took Marla and they're threatening her, or Bob got killed. But even in other aspects, for most people that are like normal people living normal circumstances, the idea is just you could lose out for someone you genuinely care about because you don't express it, because you're not close to them, you're not vulnerable, right? Like most people understand the idea of if you don't show any vulnerability to someone, you never open up, you're never going to get to be that close to them. You can be friendly, right? You can care about them, but it's not that close of an attachment, whereas typically there might be either a turning point or a gradualism of the idea of you start kind of exposing more and more about yourself and your vulnerabilities, as does the other person, and hopefully, you're doing that in a way that's welcomed. And again, fitting with what is welcomed by the other person. But there is the aspect of that's how you form closeness, right? And vulnerability, by the way, doesn't need to just be like a sad aspect. Vulnerability can be, this is a thing I super love and super care about in a nice way, something that makes you super happy, and talking about what it makes you feel. And that whole aspect is completely prevented from the narrator because of the Tyler within him. And while the Tyler within him completely rejects all of society and all of the things and all the lifestyles, both of these characters have, both the narrator and Tyler, in the beginning of their characters, are lacking one huge thing, which is attachment figures in their life. Neither one of them has that. It's just that Tyler rejects it. Tyler says, fuck it, I don't need that. And as much as I like the whole quote, even though I know a lot of really toxic communities adopted it, I really like the whole quote about you're not special, we're all the same, decaying organic matter, you're not a special or unique snowflake. I like it because to me, I'm saying everyone means you too, you know? Everyone means everyone is just this thing, and that unites all of us, all of humanity together. Whereas to him, it's a way to invalidate people's hurt. Or I guess not even to him in that specific moment, which is why I like this quote, but like generally throughout the film, he's very invalidating of hurt, or not even seeing it, right? He's invalidating of it because whenever the narrator starts freaking out and worrying about things, he's completely invalidating it and putting him down. But honestly, even when they're like walking around the city and looking at ads and being like, is that what a man looks like? And mocking the idea of a man wanting to look like that, like the guys on the ads, as opposed to understanding there's a vulnerable aspect of people not being happy with how they look, and they might feel like, oh, that's what I need to look like, and they might want to be accepted and loved and appreciated, and for people to be attracted to them, and all these aspects. They're completely unempathetic. They never try to put themselves in other people's shoes and understand their needs, and understand that being influenced by other people is not a bad thing. And I think that's another really huge point of the film, with the whole attachment figure thing, it relates to it, is this thing where there's a kind of very toxic mindset that I think, again, very much so has an overlap with toxic masculinity, and therefore tends to be very prevalent in men and, like, I don't know, red pill spaces and stuff like that, but I think is prevalent generally in a lot of societies for anyone, which is this whole idea of you don't need to rely on other people. Your goal should be being independent entirely, right? And nobody forms it like that, because when we do, we understand it's silly, right? You rely on other people, presumably you don't create every single thing in your house, right? Like, I didn't make this shirt, I didn't make these glasses, I didn't, farm the food that I eat, right? All of these different things. We understand we have a reliance on other people, but we limit that to kind of, colder, less emotional things. Like, it's okay for me to do that because, that's those people's jobs. But whenever it comes to any kind of vulnerability, I think there's a really huge place for people to understand that that's also not a thing that you should be ashamed of, is not something that you should reject. Because I really, if you were someone that knows me, you know that or you might know, I really, really hate this thing where people say, oh, why do you even care what other people think? There's a usefulness to it, which is other people doing something should not necessarily reflect to you that that's the good thing to do, or even that, everyone is going to view it this way, right? But I think a smarter way to maybe do that, while not being invalidating, would be, I understand why you care what other people think, but at the same time, you should maybe consider maybe those are not people you want to be around, right? I think people saying, instead of that, for example, people will also say, if someone rejects you for it, fuck them. You don't want to be with them anyways. I think that's a way better way to phrase it, while it's still not as validating, and I think you probably should be, because you understand there's a vulnerability there. it's more so trying to put the aspect forth of, you know, you deserve better than that. You deserve people that will appreciate you for who you are. And obviously, this isn't holistically. There are things that you should look at society and understand. You might actually have some flaws within you. Most of us do, or all of us do, really. But this whole narrative of you should just completely act as though other people don't influence you whatsoever is just honestly childish to me. I think there's something kind of like a pipe dream there as well that people set up for themselves. And they don't understand that's not how people function. All you're doing is shutting yourself off from your emotions, which in turn just means that you're going to not feel happy anyways. Because again, you don't access the happiness within you too that way. Like, did we ever really see the characters there, like, happy at the point where they're destroying things? They're, like, happy that they're, like, achieving something. Like, you see the Fight Club guys, right? Whenever they not blew up the building, but, like, whenever they burned the building and created, like, the smiley face, they're, like, all proud of themselves because they think they're satisfying their great leader, Tyler. So they're proud of themselves. Like, yeah, someone is going to validate me, right? And as soon as he says anything against that, they all shut up. They all stop laughing. They all stop smiling and all these things. Because that's what they're seeking. They might not know that's what they're seeking. They're telling themselves we're destroying society and we're tearing down these awful systems, but that's what they're doing. And this whole thing goes back to another aspect that I think is really important in politics too, but also just interpersonally. When you're tearing down systems, you need to understand what are the systems you're tearing down and why you're tearing them down and what is the actual problem. Because there might be systems that are somewhat dysfunctional but have a good utility at the end of the day, and you need to work around that to find a way to better utilize these systems. There are systems that you might actually want to completely get rid of, but you need to understand the system to fix it, or to know that you actually need to get rid of it, right? If you like to take a medical example that might be a little easier to understand. If someone has like a little bit of a lump or something, and you don't know if it's cancerous or not, or non-malignant, right? What they do is they take a biopsy. They go test that thing to know, do we remove it or not? You need to understand the thing to know if it's good, if it's not harmful, or if it is. And that aspect, I think, is really lacking in Fight Club, and in, again, the misinterpretation that a lot of people take away from it. They're now validating themselves, and they're getting rid of this whole aspect of attachment because they're saying this is the problem. The problem is the fact that the narrator wants to buy things to impress people. He wants to seem smart. He wants to, all these different things. Get a job that, he talks a little bit about, calling his dad and all that stuff. He wants to constantly satisfy other people, which can be a problem if he doesn't give any space for his own feelings. But alongside that, when you completely reject people, you're never going to get validated for the real you, whatever that means, right? You're never going to get validated and loved and given security and attachment that you want. And you're going to, maybe hurt other people or miss people that you do like, but you're never showing that to them because you're not showing vulnerability. And yeah, I think that, again, I'm sorry I'm a little bit all over the place because I'm having some new thoughts that I've never thought of before either about the film, which is fun. But going back to that whole thing is the whole idea of someone having balls is a saying of you have guts, all that stuff. It means you have guts or something like that, right? The whole idea of removing it is they're removing it from people that are going against the ideal. Those are people that are showing either vulnerability or a want for the system. And when you pay attention to it, all the people that have that kind of either threat or that already happened to them are not doing anything wrong, right? The whole idea of demasculinizing those people is not actually to good ends. The men in the support group lost their testicles because they had cancer, and the film, in a sense, I guess, taking that away from them by writing them as a character that happened to, is punishing them for things that are not necessarily bad, right? Those are people that wanted, I guess in Bob's case, it would be someone who wanted to be validated and be successful in the field that he did by juicing and using steroids and all that stuff, right? He was seeking some approval from other people and he got punished for it because he was doing that in destructive ways. But with a lot of the other men too, those are characters that are written in a way where all we know about them is the fact that that was removed from them, and they're showing vulnerability. And that tie in your brain connects, right? Like, okay, cool. The people that show vulnerability, the men that cry, that hug each other, that talk to each other, those are those men, right? Or with the deputy, right? The deputy that was trying to do that. I'm by no means defending all police. I think there's plenty of issues with police stations and all that stuff and the criminal justice system. But specifically for the film, all he was trying to do is stop an actual network that was genuinely causing harm to property for means of, in a sense, terrorism. I mean, terrorism is just like political action, violence in the name of a political ideal. So technically it's terrorism, right? And they're causing a lot of mayhem that, while still being to property, is also causing like some harm to people around. And all he was trying to do is investigate that and put a stop to that. And he got threatened with having his testicles removed because the whole idea is you're part of that system. You're part of the system. There's no different systems in the Tyler worldview, because it's all one thing. It's all a holistic thing. And when you do that, you miss the fact that there are parts of the system that might be good, right? Or parts that might be functional. And the idea is you're a part of the system. You represent this thing that I hate, that I don't like. You need to be taken down, and you need to be demasculinized, because this is the whole thing of like claiming the masculinity within yourself as the identifying feature, as you might see with like red pillars, for example, or like people that follow that movement, or incels. And when I mean incels, I don't mean literally people that are just like involuntarily celibate, but people that identify as such, because I think there's a difference between both. Is a quote that I really like. You know, normal people just call that being a virgin. So when we talk about that whole aspect of it, the idea is you need to be stripped of that label of a man, because you're not really a man because you're going against that system. And there's that, and there's also whenever the narrator tries to basically alert authorities about what's going on, and generally we learned that the protocol was if anyone tries to interfere with Project Mayhem, they get castrated. And again, taking away their manhood because they're rebelling against the other system that Tyler formed that is masculinity to them, that is strength to them. And trying to care about the harm that you might cause to other people in that project by alerting authorities or anyone else is not masculine to them. Caring about other people is not masculine to them. And more than anything is not wanted. Because again, taking it outside of just the masculine lens of it, this could be applicable to anyone else, because again, I think people generally are vulnerable to leaning in, maybe in different ways. We know from research that men and women, obviously this differs for non-binary people, depending maybe on their upbringing or societally how they're treated, but for men and women alone, there's differences in terms of coping mechanism typically, whereas generally men tend to lash out more and women tend to internalize more. And I think a part of that is also that, like, for women generally, there's this understanding or this idea that, like, you probably have someone to talk to, which isn't necessarily true. And when we look at data, men and women, if I remember correctly from data I've looked at, have about the same amount of friends on average, or close friendships at least on average. But there's this idea that for women it's way more accepted to talk about their emotions. That doesn't mean that they're always validated or whatever, but there's a route, whereas for men they're not listened to. So, you know, violence is the is the voice of the unheard, to kind of paraphrase a quote from MLK. And you need to lash out because otherwise nobody notices you. And like, whenever we have that whole thing, we can understand though that while that might manifest differently for men than it does for women, both of these people, again, live in a society where vulnerability is not a thing that's often rewarded or viewed as rewardable. It can be interpersonally rewarded by people in your life, but as a general society, we do have this whole narrative of you should just be independent, you should rely on yourself, you should have your own sense of confidence. And I think that when we do that, we kind of ignore the fact that, I'm sorry to tell you, if you're a confident person, more likely than anything, that just means you had really good people in your life, which is great. I'm happy for you. But you should recognize that, because one, that means that other people are not just not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and just not being insecure, right? That also means that there might be people in your life that you owe more thanks to than you actually recognize. And besides that, that also means that it's more easily changeable. When you tell people, like, just be secure, just, just be happy, just whatever. If you went up to, like, the narrators of the world and you told them that, he doesn't have anything to do with that. He's not happy. Like, nobody ever became happy by someone telling them just be happy. But when we understand where that's coming from, and we understand when we compare him to a happy person, and we look at the fact that what he's lacking is close attachments, we can see where he needs work, what he needs to get. It's not all just willpower. Obviously, you need to put some of yourself into that as well, and like actually dedicate yourself to trying to get attached to people, or rather get close to people and be vulnerable to do that. But when we just tell people just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we're missing the fact that for successful people, that's not what typically saved them. When we look at any story, really, we look at of a character that struggled in any way and like was alone, they typically never get out of it just by being like, I don't even know if I'd say typically. I can't think of a story where that came out of nowhere. There had to be at least one person that showed them a little bit of kindness to kind of show to them that security and attachment is possible. And I think that, again, this film kind of shows, I focused more on the attachment aspect of it, but even when it comes to like the whole like economic aspect and the consumerism aspect of it, right, there is an area where you overconsume, where you rely on that for status and for satisfaction, and to get the dopamine hit of buying something, and again, to be validated and be looked at as more worthy for owning all these different things. But on the other aspect, you have the Tyler way of living, which is living in a dump. You don't have like running water that are clean. Like you don't have like a clean house. You don't, like, all these things. I think most people, when it comes to that aspect, can look at Tyler's house and say, that doesn't seem like a good thing to me, right? That doesn't seem like a great way to live for me. And again, this whole film to me has always been about the fact of needing to find the kind of balance between two forces. Like, where you should actually be on the spectrum between two different forces when it comes to many different aspects in life. And yeah, I'm just very frustrated because I feel like the reaction from a lot of people, and again, I see this mainly in groups of men. I've also honestly seen people that reject the movie because they view it as this thing. But the whole aspect of people looking at this film as though the idea is you should become Tyler are essentially kind of demonstrating to me the point of the film. You guys are looking at that and you're saying, oh, look at the narrator, he's vulnerable. What a pussy. Like, I don't want to be like him. And I'm saying when you say that, all you're demonstrating is that the film is right, that being vulnerable and all these things, finding attachment, is not something that's viewed as good, because for you to view the ending of the movie as not the desirable insofar as his getting with Marla in a sense, right, and kind of getting to kill that aspect of himself, of Tyler. But when we meet the narrator at the end, he's not back to being the old narrator he was in the beginning. He is a changed person because he took the good that he could from Tyler and he kind of like assimilated that into himself in a moderated way. He didn't let the Tyler overpower him. He got rid of the Tyler that was the destructive aspect of him and understood what he needs to actually take away from it. And it's a little, I guess, ironic that people that seem to take away the bad message from the movie are kind of themselves ignoring the aspect of attachment is good and are demonstrating exactly the point of our society does show people that vulnerability and seeking attachment is weakness. And again, especially when it comes to men, but again, even for women, there's the idea of like, just don't rely on other people, don't seek validation. When what we should tell people is, don't just seek validation, you should have your own personhood. But we should also understand that there's people that struggle with that, and to just tell them just find that is difficult. And you should recognize for yourself that if you are someone that has that, this is not a thing that everyone has access to as easily as you do. Similar to if you grew up like, I don't know, middle class or higher up, you can or should understand that there's people that are poor that didn't grow up in a house like that, right? So maybe you had access to better education, to like, I don't know, better means. Maybe you're in a situation where financially if something happens to you, you know you have like someone to fall back on because you have a family that has more money. It's kind of similar here, right? You tell other people, just be secure, just go and be vulnerable with people, or like, you don't even need to show vulnerability, you just have people around you. And you don't understand the reason you have those things is because you know a healthy way already to show vulnerability, maybe. And again, I think most people don't look at it as Tyler is an ideal unless they struggle with these things. So I've at least not seen people that seem to have like a lot of attachment people in their life and are happy about their life that say that. It seems to me like that's an easier way for them because it's easier to lash out, it's easier to break things down than to try to sit down and understand these things and try to be vulnerable and show yourself. It's so much easier to just say fuck them rather than sit down and try to understand why people react the way they do. And you can still say fuck them at the end of it if you understand that that's not what you want. But you could also end up realizing maybe I'm not being who I want to be, or even maybe these are just not my people. Maybe I do need to find someone who just more aligns with me. And yeah. I really love this film, and I'm really, really saddened every single time that when telling people that I really love this film, I always need to kind of emphasize the reason I love it, because a lot of people misinterpret it, and I'm kind of saddened by it because I think the film does a really good job of explaining itself, but I am, again, imagining that it's just for a lot of people, that's considered the ideal, the Tyler, the stoic, who's strong in all these things, that's the ideal, so to them it's like, that was the good guy. And yeah, I think it just kind of reflects something sad in society, but that the film itself actually does have a very interesting point. And I guess a tiny point as I'm wrapping this up, I remember a little bit from an interview that I saw with the writer of the book that the film is based on, which I read in like high school as well. And he mentioned how a lot of the story and the characters within it were formed because of people that he met in gyms and stuff like that. And if you're someone who knows anything about anything when it comes to like gym rats, you know, people that are very addicted to going to the gym and like building muscle like obsessively, a lot of times those are people that genuinely do have a lot of struggles with the way they view themselves. Like oftentimes there's people with body dysmorphia where it's never good enough for them, or they're very much so trying to reach some ideal that they're never actually gonna feel like they're reached, because they're always gonna need more and more. And the fact that within that space that's considered like an okay thing to do, because it's like, oh, you want to be masculine, you want to build more muscle, you want to be more attractive. That's considered like an okay thing to want to do. That's an okay thing to be like vulnerable about, because it's towards like an end that we validate as a society of wanting to be a strong guy. But those people still don't get to meet those attachments. I'm not saying all gym bros are like that, by the way, just to be clear, but I'm saying that's a thing that definitely exists within those spaces. And that I can understand why that's kind of adds to the point, why talking to people there is kind of what helped him create this story, because you see that vulnerability within people there that they're not validating, and they're instead being like, I'll just direct all of it towards working out, because that's okay, and that's validated by my society. It's the whole thing of like, for men, the emotion that's validated, and nobody's saying people are gonna say you're being too emotional to a guy if he's crying, whether it be for happiness or sadness, or if he's like, I don't know, like anxious, or if he's really, really happy in a way where he's really touched or anything like that. That's considered being too emotional. But whenever a guy is violent or angry, that's validated because that's considered masculine. So yeah, I feel like I can keep going in circles, but I feel like, again, as with everything else I do, I keep kind of repeating myself a lot. So I'll end it there, and I don't know how long this was, but if you happened to watch all of it for some reason, thank you. And yeah, just please, if you ever encounter someone who has this view of Fight Club, try to talk to them about it. And yeah, that's it. Bye.